Welcome to Mindset Tools Mastery. I'm David Phelan. In this presentation, How to Solve Any Problem, we're going to focus on a process that you can use to address anything that might come up in your business or in your personal life that's interfering with the results you want, so that you can grow your online business, you can make an impact in the lives of others, and create sustainable income in the process. So I'd like to start with an analogy. And I want to use an analogy to help us to see where we get stuck and why we get stuck, and also how to get unstuck. This may be an analogy that you've heard me use before, but I want you to imagine yourself in a situation where there's a big dog running at you, barking, growling, salivating, looking hungry, looking mean. What would you be thinking that this dog is going to do to you? Well, you might be thinking the dog is going to bite you. And if you're thinking the dog was going to bite you, how would you feel? Well, you might feel afraid. And if you're thinking the dog is going to bite you and you're feeling afraid, what would you do? Well, you might freeze, or you might run, or you might defend yourself. Okay? Now, imagine the exact same situation. This big dog is running at you, barking, growling, salivating, looking hungry, looking mean. But you know this dog. You know there's absolutely no way in the world this dog is going to bite you. It's not going to attack you. It's not going to scratch you. It's not going to jump on you. It's not going to do anything. If you're thinking to yourself, the dog is not going to bite you, would you feel afraid? No. And if you're not feeling afraid, would you freeze? Would you run? Would you defend yourself? No. So does that make sense that our thinking that the dog is going to bite us drives the feeling that we have, and the feeling is driving our behavior? Okay, now, here's the important question. In those two situations, what changed? Well, what changed is our thinking. Because we know the dog, then that knowing, and knowing that the dog is not going to bite us, changes the feeling, and the feeling changes the behavior. And the critical distinction is, did anything the big dog do change? No. And the reason that's so important is that the big dog represents everything that happens outside of us. The big dog is your customers, the big dog is the market, the big dog is your spouse, your partner, it's your vendors, it's last month's sales numbers. Nothing that happens outside of us is directly impacting the way that we feel, and the way that we feel is driving our behavior. Nothing outside of us is directly impacting us. It all has to get filtered through our thinking first. Now, the problem with that is that we don't talk like that in our society. What we hear over and over and over are statements that are similar to, you make me angry, or she hurt my feelings. Both of those statements assume that there's a direct connection between the other person's behavior, the circumstances, the stuff that's outside of us. There's a direct connection between that and the way that I feel. What's actually happening, though, is it's all getting processed through our thinking first. So let me give you an example of that. Imagine somebody that you really care about calls you a really foul name. How would you feel about that? Well, if you thought they were serious, you might feel hurt, or you might feel offended. Okay, now imagine that same person has been in a terrible car accident, and they're lying in a hospital bed attached to all sorts of tubes and wires. And you can see that they're heavily medicated, and their eyes are kind of glassy. And right at the point that you approach the bedside, somebody else inadvertently hits the bed. And that person, that loved one, winces in pain and looks at you and calls you that same foul name. Would you be offended? Probably not, or at least not as offended, right? So it's not the word itself that gives the offense, but it's our thinking about it, right? And so the reason that we get stuck is because of this confusion between what's happening outside of us and our reaction. So I want to give you some definitions that can be helpful as we're doing this work. So we're going to talk about the circumstances. In the analogy, the big dog is the circumstances, right? And I want you to think about circumstances as objective facts. Objective facts, something, as an example, that could be entered as evidence into a court of law. So I was talking with a client the other day, and she was having a disagreement with her husband. And I was asking her to try to describe the circumstances, to try to separate out the facts from her reaction. And initially she was saying things like, he's not being as helpful as he could, right? And she thinks that what she's talking about is the facts. And I helped her to see that she's assessing the behavior and she's coming to a conclusion. He's not helpful, right? So the facts would be things like, of the 10 things that there were to do, he did one of them, right? The behavior would be the objective fact. Or I was talking with another client and she was telling me about a conflict between her and her mom, and the facts were what was the text that was sent to her, right? Those are the objective facts. And then the reaction is things like, he's not being helpful, or she's being mean, or something like that. So again, facts are objective, circumstances are objective facts. They could be entered as evidence into a court of law. And it's helpful for us to remember that facts, the circumstances, are neutral. And again, this is a really challenging concept for many of the clients that I work with. What do you mean it's neutral? What do you mean the sales numbers that I got last month are neutral? Yes, indeed, they're neutral. And let me see if I can help you with that. So often an example that I use is to think about a political speech, right? So say Donald Trump gives a speech. Does it make sense to you that two people can listen to that speech and have very different reactions? Yeah. What that tells us is that the reaction isn't in the speech itself, right? If it was in the speech, we'd all feel the same way about it. Okay. Another example of that, and I was just talking with a young adult about this, and she was in a situation where there were people that were talking about her behind her back. And I said, okay, now imagine that those people were talking about you, but you didn't know they were talking about you. Would you be bothered by that? And she recognized she wouldn't. So it's not that they were talking about her, it's her thoughts about that. Who's talking about me? What are they saying? Why are they saying it? Right? So until she gets her thinking involved with it, it's not good or bad. It doesn't become good or bad until she starts thinking about it. Now, I'm not suggesting that her assessment is inaccurate. I just want her to be able to separate out the thoughts from the circumstances, her reaction, her thinking, her feeling, her behavior from the circumstances. And part of that separation is recognizing that often we don't have control over the circumstance. We can't control what somebody else thinks. We can't control the choices that our customers make. We can't control what's happening with the economy, like the changing in interest rates, those kinds of things. Those are our circumstances, and we can't control them. Now, my response, again, in contrast to the thinking, in contrast to the circumstances, which are objective facts, my response is my thinking, my feeling, and my behavior. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about thinking. So there's two primary types of thinking. One is what I call language-based thinking. So it's like sentences that you could write down. So if I say to myself something like, I'm never going to figure this out, that's a sentence that I could write down. Or if I say to myself, my customers really appreciate the work that I do, again, that's a sentence that I can write down. So some of our thinking is language-based. Some of our thinking is what I call sensory representations. So what we imagine with our five senses, what we might see in our mind, or imagine that we heard, taste, smell, feel. Often our sensory representations are things like our memories of the past or anticipations of the future, right? And so it's helpful to remember that whether it's a sentence in our mind or whether it's a sensory representation, it's helpful to remember that our thoughts are representations. They're not the thing itself. So for a long time, I had a painting of a lighthouse and an ocean in my office. And when I was trying to help my clients to to create this distinction, I would say to them, is that the lighthouse and an ocean? And oftentimes they would say, yeah, it's a lighthouse and an ocean. And then I would say, or is it more accurate to say that it's a painting of a lighthouse in the ocean? And they would, immediately get that distinction. So in the same way that the painting isn't the thing itself, our thoughts are representations. They're not real. They might be real thoughts, but they're only representations. Now, sometimes our representations can be very accurate, but sometimes they can be way off. So I would say to my clients, imagine that the artist who is painting that painting was painting a dog. That would be a terrible representation of a dog. Now, I happen to know the artist and know that that's a pretty good likeness of what she was painting. But even as accurate as it might be, it's still only a representation. And sometimes when I'm working with that idea, the word that I'll use is an illusion. Now, it's a compelling illusion, but it's still an illusion. Have you ever seen an illusionist like David Copperfield? The ones who are really good, the experience that we have is, I know that that's not real, but I can't see how it's done, right? Now, sometimes illusionists aren't very good, and it's like, I can see what you're doing, right? Sometimes it's done for comedy, but when it's not, it's just not very satisfying, right? So our mind is like that. They're illusions. It's not real. It's only a representation, but it's compelling. And what I mean by that is that when we have those things in our mind, our body is responding as if that's real. And we'll talk about that in another presentation. Okay, so we have our thoughts, the sentences, or the representations in our mind. The second category is our feelings, right? Now, when you think about feelings and when you're trying to do this work of problem solving, it can be helpful to think about a feeling as being stated in one word. So let's say that my sales numbers were not what I wanted to be last month. So the feeling might be dissatisfied. So that's one word, okay? So we want to look for a one-word description of it. And what we're describing is what's happening in our body. So there are sensations that we're experiencing in our body. Now, if you imagine two people, one who's happy and one who's depressed, and you imagine what they look like, oftentimes you can see it. You can see it in their presentation, right? The happy person might be smiling. They might be moving more energetically. The depressed person their face might be more flat, and their movements might be, might look like they're heavier and slower. So as you're thinking about the descriptions, can you see what I mean by like the energy of it? So a feeling is an energy or a vibration that's experiencing in our body, okay? And as you're thinking about that, I want you to think about the feeling as being finite, okay? And this can be a really helpful distinction when you're working on solving problems. So think about that sensation of dissatisfied. Where do you experience that in your body? Is it more like you experience it in your feet, or is it more like you experience it in your chest? Is it more in your chest or more in your head or more in your stomach? So think about wherever it is that you experience, and imagine that you could draw an outline around the feeling. And notice what it feels like within the outline and what it feels like outside. So I was working with a client earlier today and doing this exercise, and she said, outside the outline, it just feels neutral. It doesn't feel anything at all, right? So we're talking about the area is limited. And then we're also talking about the idea that how long does that feeling last? Sometimes it feels like it's going on, but then when I actually help my clients to think about their experience of it, it's like they might have that feeling, but then they get caught up in doing something else. And while they're doing whatever that thing is, they're not really feeling that same feeling. So what they're getting is like short bursts of the feeling, okay? So the area is limited. The duration is also limited. and the intensity. No matter how intense it is, there's a limit to it. So if we can recognize that the feeling is this energy or vibration that we're having in our body and it's limited, then it becomes easier to work with. So we want to think about our reaction, we want to think about our thinking, we want to think about our feeling, and we want to think about the behavior that we're engaging in. And so when I say behavior, I'm talking about the action that you take, what you physically do or what you say, right? The way in which you're using your body. So our thinking and our feeling and our behavior are leading to the results that we get. And when you think about the results, it's helpful to recognize that every action we take gets a result. Now, sometimes they're not the results that we want, but if we recognize the behavior got us the result, then we can also recognize that if we want a different result, all we need to do is change the behavior, okay? And so we'll talk about managing our behavior and managing our reactions to be able to get to the results, right? But we want to start with just thinking about our thinking, our feeling, our behavior, and the results that we're getting. So to solve any problem, it's helpful to have a clear understanding of where we are right now. You might think of it as like point A, and where you want to get to, point B. And think about the A and the B of it before trying to figure out how to get from A to B. So we're going to talk about the clear understanding of where you are now first. So in this process of solving problems, it's always helpful to start by grounding yourself in your faith. And by that specifically, I mean to keep in mind several things. One is that God made you. And God made you with the capacity to solve any problem. So when you go into problem solving, if you know that you already have that capacity on board, it can be very helpful. Second, remember that God loves you. And nothing that you can do or fail to do is going to change that. So you're secure in God's love for you. And also, you already have everything that you need. Anything that you're going to do is going to be a bonus to what you already have. You already have everything that you need. And so from that place of security and abundance, then we can begin to address the problem. So the first thing that I encourage you to do is to write down a brief description of what the problem is. You can do that in bullets or just a brief paragraph. So it might be something like, I'm having difficulty figuring out what my niche is. Or it might be, I'm trying to adopt a new CRM and I'm getting stuck. Okay, so you want a brief description of what it is. Now, to that brief description, you want to make sure that you add, why is it that this situation is even something that's on your radar? I mean, there's billions of things that you could be thinking about. Why this particular thing? So it might be that you are, trying to figure out your CRM, and you had given yourself an hour to work on it, and you ended up thinking about it for 3 hours, and you just ended up spinning your wheels, and so now you don't have time to do the other things that you wanted to get done. That's why it's on your radar. So a brief description of what the problem is, including why it's on your radar. Now, the next step is to remind yourself that the problem is never the problem. And what I mean by that is when you think about the description that you wrote down, most of the time what we're going to be describing is the circumstance. And we want to create the distinction between the circumstance and the response. An analogy that I often use is having a problem is kind of like being stuck in a prison cell. If the key to that cell is outside the cell and beyond your reach, you're stuck and there's nothing you can do about it. If, however, the key is inside the prison cell and you're able to find the key, then you'll be able to liberate yourself and the problem will be resolved. So I'm going to suggest to you that if the problem is the circumstance and you can't control the circumstance, you're stuck. But if the problem actually is our response to the circumstance, then we can change our thinking, our feeling, and behavior, and we can liberate ourselves. So when you're trying to create this distinction between the circumstance and the response, it's helpful to just make two columns, title one circumstance and the other response, and to write down everything that's going through your mind about this problem, about this situation, in one of the two columns. Now remember, circumstances are just the facts. Sometimes we think about our, as I said earlier, our assessment as a fact. So make sure it's something that could be like entered as evidence into a court of law. That's the circumstance. Everything else is going to be our response. Now, after you've like dumped your mind, everything that you're thinking, everything that's going through your mind, and you're getting it into one of these two columns, then I want you to put an asterisk next to the items that you can control. The reason this is important is that if our focus is on things that we can't control, we're going to stay stuck. Again, the key is outside the cell. We're not going to be able to liberate ourselves. So we want to be able to focus on the things that we can control. After we've begun to identify what's going on, then we want to make an inquiry about our response. So the things that we want to notice are our thoughts. So you're going to write down your specific thoughts about the problem that you're having. So let's say that the problem is that I'm not able to figure out my niche. I've just kind of been spinning about that. So my thoughts might include things like, if my niche is broad, then I'm going to be able to attract more people. On the other hand, if my niche is too broad, then it's going to be difficult to target my marketing. So maybe a narrower niche is better. Maybe another thought that goes along with that is, this other person has got this niche and it seems to be working for them. Maybe I should do something like that. Or another thought might be, there's this program that I could purchase to try to help me figure out what my niche is, but it costs a certain amount of money, and am I really going to get the results that I'm wanting out of it? And is it worth the investment? And I'm really struggling to figure this out, and I'm feeling discouraged, and those are all things that are going through your mind. You want to make sure that all of those things are captured. Again, dump your mind, whatever's going through your mind, simply write it down. Now, for each one of those thoughts, you're going to want to go through them one at a time. Now, that might seem overwhelming at first, but I guarantee you, after a little practice with this, you're going to find that it goes pretty quickly. The first question that we want to ask ourselves about each thought is, why am I choosing to have this thought? So if I'm thinking to myself, I'm having a hard time figuring this out, why am I choosing to think that thought? That question does two things for us. One is that it increases our agency or our personal power. If I'm choosing this thought, then I'm recognizing that I can choose a different thought. The second thing that it does for us is it acknowledges history. And what I mean by that is, given your DNA and given the experiences that you have had up to that point in your life, you weren't ever going to think a different thought, right? There's a pattern to the thoughts that we think. And so if we recognize, well, of course I'm having this thought because of these other things that I've gone through, it allows us to be gentle with ourselves in that kind of situation. And also to recognize, again, with that sense of agency, that just because I thought that yesterday doesn't mean that I need to keep thinking that thought. The past does not equal the future. So when I'm asking myself, why am I choosing to have this thought? It increases my personal power, increases my agency, and then acknowledges the history, allows me to be gentle with myself so that I can keep going. The next thing that you that may be helpful to think about is, what about this thought is a representation or is an illusion? If I'm saying to myself, I'm having a hard time figuring this out, I'm creating a representation about me. I'm having a hard time. I'm thinking about myself as a person who has a hard time figuring things out, right? I'm also representing this, whatever this is. I'm having a hard time figuring this out, right? These are things that I'm representing to myself. And again, if I recognize it's only a representation, then I'm empowered to change the representation. What if I represented myself as a person who has figured things out? Maybe I represent myself as a person who is resilient. Look at all these things that I've gone through. Maybe I've tried a number of business things that haven't worked, but I keep going, right? How am I representing it? That's easier to do when I'm recognizing that my thoughts are illusions or representations. Next, I can ask myself, is this thought supportive or unsupportive to the ultimate result that I want? Now, when we're stuck in a problem, oftentimes what we're thinking about is, I just want to get unstuck. And so the analogy that I would use is, it's kind of like driving. And let's say there's an accident and you come to a complete stop, right? And you just want to get your car moving again, right? That's like the problem that you're having. And so after a while, then you notice traffic is starting to move and you feel some relief. Great, we're moving again. But then you soon realize that you're moving because you're being detoured, and you're being detoured away from your destination. How satisfying is that? Probably not satisfying at all, right? So we don't just want the problem to be solved, we want to get to our destination. So this question about, is the thought supportive or unsupportive, we're asking ourselves that in reference to the ultimate destination, what I ultimately want, okay? So we inquire about our thinking. The next part is to inquire about the feelings that are associated with this. So for each thought, it's helpful to write down, how does this thought feel? Again, you want to write it down in one word. If I'm thinking to myself, I'm having a hard time figuring this out, how does that feel? It feels discouraging, okay? And again, it might help to contrast it as you're trying to figure out what that's like in your body. The contrast might be like, do I feel it more in my feet or more in my hands? Do I feel it more in my hands or more in my chest? When we're identifying what it feels like, and we're identifying that it's limited, then we can recognize that it's okay for me to have this feeling. Sometimes what causes more distress than the unpleasant feeling itself is the resistance to feeling that. I don't want to feel afraid. I don't want to feel frustrated. I don't want to feel discouraged. And so I'm going to do all of these other things so I don't have to feel that, but these other things cause even more distress. So we can recognize that it's finite in its space, it's finite in how long it lasts, it's finite in its intensity, and sometimes it's okay just to sit with it, okay? So we're discovering that it's limited, and then for each of the thoughts that we're having, we want to repeat those questions. What's the word to describe it? Where am I feeling it? What's that feeling like? And again, noticing that it's finite. We also might recognize that we're having some feelings when we're in the middle of that problem, and we can't really put a finger on the thought that gets associated with it. And that's okay. Particularly at the beginning when we're working with this, I know that I'm irritated, but I can't really put my finger on why I'm irritated. That's okay. Just write that down. I'm irritated. Again, try to describe what it's like in your body. Feel the feeling of it, and then just notice, okay? So for each thought that we're having and any feelings that are not associated with a particular thought, we just want to be able to identify. We're just curious about the feelings that we're experiencing. The next part then is to inquire about our behavior, right? You might want to ask yourself, what did I do that was helpful? Well, maybe what I did was I scheduled some time to address the problem. And maybe I did some research to try to address the problem. And I can see that those are helpful things. Then what did I do that was not helpful? Again, from the example that I used before, maybe I intended to spend an hour and I'm spending 3 hours, and I was spending that time just in my mind spinning, and I wasn't really getting anywhere with it. Okay, so what did I do that was helpful? What did I do that was not helpful? Maybe the unhelpful thing that I said was, when I was feeling irritated, I talked to one of my clients in that space of irritation, so I didn't really show up well for my client. Or maybe I was short with a vendor. Those are things that can not only cause difficulty with this particular problem, but they can cause additional challenges for us as well. So what did I do that was helpful? What did I do that was not helpful? Then I can ask myself also, is that behavior related to a habit or a pattern that I can identify? So our mind's primary job is to keep us safe. When we go through something difficult, it could be a trauma, it could be a disappointing situation, our mind is going to try to protect us. And so sometimes what happens is we act in a way that is protective in that situation. Maybe I go through something difficult, and in the midst of that, it's like, oh, this is too intense. I'm going to think about something completely different. So rather than remaining present in the problem, now I'm distracted. Well, then maybe a habit of distraction begins. At any time I run into something difficult, rather than dealing with it head on, I allow myself to become distracted. Maybe I distract with TV or with social media, what's happening on my phone. Maybe I distract with alcohol or drugs or sex, or there are a lot of different things, eating. There are a lot of different things that we can do to distract ourselves rather than dealing with the situation. But if I recognize that habit or that pattern started initially as my mind's attempt to protect myself, again, I can be gentle with myself, right? So when did the habit or pattern start? How did it start? How was the pattern or habit protective when it started? And at what point did it stop being helpful or protective? As I'm inquiring about these things, it's easier for me to see what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And the more that I recognize that, the easier it is to shift the behavior. Next, we want to inquire about the result that we're wanting. Again, how clear are we about the result? Is the result that we are pursuing the same or different from where we started? Sometimes we're going along and we kind of shift gears without even realizing that that's what we've done. We pivot, and now we're pursuing something different. And is the thing that we're pursuing what we really want? An example of that might be, going back to the example of the niche, is that you might be have content that's really helpful, but as you're trying to figure out what your niche is, that may end up shifting the content that you want to deliver, and then you get to a place where this is not really what I want, or this is not really what's going to be most helpful to my clients. Okay, so when we're thinking about the result and we're trying to clarify, what is it that I'm really after? Okay, and then am I moving towards that result? Am I moving away from that result? Am I just not moving at all? So we inquire about the result that we're going after. Now, after we inquire about our thinking, our feelings, our behavior, and the result, sometimes it makes sense to make some initial adjustments. And in making initial adjustments, our faith can really serve us here. So we may be able to identify changes just right off the top from what our faith tells us. And we may recognize we're not really serving people as well as we can. And so we can make adjustments in our behavior simply from knowing that. Or we might recognize that our thinking really isn't aligned with what we really believe, what our faith tells us, and we can make some adjustments there. It can be really helpful at this point to be just open to any internal promptings. Sometimes we get a sense about something and we can't necessarily articulate it. We may not know exactly where it's coming from, but if we have that internal prompting, it's helpful just to be aware of it. If you are able to articulate it, just write it down. Okay, so our faith can serve us in making initial adjustments. And then those initial adjustments can be in our thinking, our feeling, and our behavior. So an adjustment that can come in terms of our thinking is we can ask ourselves, what can I learn from my pattern of thinking in this situation? As I'm exploring my thinking and what I'm learning from that, just the learning alone can help me to make changes in my thinking. So even before I start to ask myself, what result am I really going after? I can recognize that if I'm telling myself that I'm, not able to figure things out, that thinking is not going to serve me in any result that I'm going after. So that's an example of an initial adjustment that I can make. Same thing with our feelings. We can ask ourselves, what am I learning from the feelings? What am I learning from the way these habits of responding have developed? And I can ask myself, what would it be like if I just let that feeling be? If I didn't resist it, if I didn't try to change it, what would happen? When we're thinking about our feelings, it's helpful to remember that our feelings are like light bulbs. If I flip a switch, the light's going to come on because the light doesn't have any choice. It's just the result of the light being switched. So the switch being flipped. Our thoughts are the light switch. If I have that thought, then I'm going to have that feeling. If we don't resist the feelings, we're going to be able to resolve them more quickly. And again, what we said earlier is that the fear of having an unpleasant feeling creates more distress than the impairment than the feeling itself. We can also inquire about our behavior and what I can learn from my pattern of behavior in the situation. And are there any changes that I want to make in how I approach things in general? Okay, so we inquire about our thinking, our feeling, our behavior results. Then just from that inquiry, we might be able to identify some initial adjustments. And after that, and all, by the way, all of that is sort of like the condition A, point A, where am I, right? And then we want to think about, where do I want to get to? So after we finish with inquiring about where we are right now, then we can start to ask ourselves, how do we move forward? The second part of the problem-solving process is always going to be the getting results process. I'm going to address the getting results process in our next presentation. So I know we covered a lot of information in a very short amount of time. I'm hopeful that it was beneficial to you, that there have been some things that you can draw from this. It really has been a pleasure to be able to share these ideas with you. I love this work that I do with my clients, the benefit that they're able to get from it, the changes that they're able to make, and I'm hoping for that same thing for you. Now, I know that some of you, you might be in a place where what I'm offering doesn't really make sense to you, or it doesn't seem like it would work for you, or it might be different from a process that you're already using. And if that's the case, that's okay. That's great. Really, to your own self, be true. But if you are in a place where this does make sense to you, I would really encourage you to try these steps out. You have this recording. You can go back through it. You can listen to it again. You can go through the steps. If you're not using them already, I would really encourage you to try them out. And also to keep in mind that you don't have to do this work alone. There's a lot of groups that are available that are helping online entrepreneurs and online content creators. So I really encourage you to plug into one of those groups. If you would like more information about the work that I do, I'm certainly willing to share that with you. If you're not currently working with me, but you would like to, please feel free to reach out. Thank you for joining us. My name is David Phelan, and until next time, remember that God is blessing.